My son said if you hate living with us, leave. So I stopped paying their $9, $300 bills. If someone asked me why I'm still living here, I'd smile and say, because my children need me. I just never imagined there'd come a day when they'd turn around and ask, so what are you still doing here? Mom, my name is Linda Monroe, 60 years old. My life has been a quiet collection of years spent being a mother, a wife, and now a grandmother. After my husband passed, I moved in with Kevin, my son, and his little family. At this age, all I really wanted was to watch my grandkids grow up, maybe share a bit of wisdom from a life already lived. I didn't think that one day my presence might feel unnecessary. Every morning is the same. Before anyone stirs, I'm already up, brewing a fresh pot of coffee, tidying up, preparing breakfast for Ava, Ethan, and little Lily. They're sweet, innocent, too young to understand the things happening around them. To them, the sun rising each morning is just a given, just like their parents, who believe everything they have now simply came to be. I placed the fresh pancakes on the table, gently straightening Ava's books, so she'd be ready for school. On my way past the living room, I paused. A piece of paper lay on the floor. I bent down and picked it up. A copy of this month's mortgage bill. Between the house payments, Ava and Ethan's private school tuition, utilities insurance, the costs pile up to nearly $300 a month. It's a heavy burden, especially with the only man in the house having been out of work for almost 6 months now. The only thing keeping things afloat is the steady stream of dividends from the investments I built over 30 years as an accountant. Quietly, I transfer the funds. I pay the bills, so their world doesn't have to miss a beat. I never told Kevin, and Kevin never asked. Back in my room, I opened the old brown notebook. The last line read, dividend income, $12,315 this month. I closed the book and tucked it back in the drawer. Lily's giggle rang out from the bedroom, followed by the sound of tiny feet pattering down the hallway. I smiled. Kevin shuffled into the kitchen doorway, hair a mess, dark circles under his eyes. He sank into a chair and poured himself some coffee. Jessica followed behind, eyes fixed on her phone, brow furrowed. They're calling again about Ava's tutoring fees, she muttered, tossing the phone onto the table. They need payment by the end of the week. Kevin shrugged. Tell Mom. Jessica glanced at me, her tone sharp, her eyes indifferent. Might as well let her cover everything. Who else could handle all these expenses? I smiled, pretending not to hear. But I did. Every word. Jessica picked up a utility bill from the table, reading it aloud with a long sigh. Honestly, Mom should think about cutting back. She stays home all day, yet the bills keep going up. The words floated out casually, but they were colder than the early winter wind slipping in from the porch. She doesn't do much besides cook and pay bills anyway. Jessica added soft, but just loud enough. Older people should know their place. Kevin said nothing. He sat there, stirring his coffee, eyes fixed on the tabletop. I knew he understood exactly who was keeping this house running. But he chose silence, pride wounded, the dignity of a man unable to provide for his own family. Kevin's silence hurt even more than Jessica's words. Still, I smiled. I cleared the dishes, wiped the flour from the table. The kids chattered at the breakfast table. Ava climbed into her chair. Ethan reached for the syrup. Lily squealed with laughter, so full of life, so blissfully unaware of how adults project their failures onto each other. I don't blame Kevin. How could I somewhere? Deep inside, I still believe a mother should never ask for anything in return. After breakfast, I slipped on a light sweater and stepped out onto the porch. The morning was cool. the air tinged with the earthy scent of damp grass. I settled into the wooden chair, holding a cup of coffee, now gone cold, watching the sunlight weave through the branches of the old maple tree. And I found myself wondering if one day I were to leave this place, would anyone even notice? At my age, I thought all I needed was a little peace. But as it turns out, even peace is a luxury. That Friday evening, Jessica invited a new coworker over for dinner, Ms. Wilson, Ava's teacher. I didn't object. Not that I had any right to object anymore. I was busy in the kitchen, preparing the honey-glazed roast the kids loved so much. The smell of meat filled the air. I heard Ava skipping on the porch, Ethan chasing behind her, and little Lily toddling after them, laughing out loud. They were still so innocent, so full of joy. None of this was their fault. I set the dishes on the table, wiped away the oil splatters on the stove. Over a decade, working as an accountant had taught me precision, attention to detail habits not so easily discarded just because the years had added up. Jessica walked in, holding a bottle of red wine she had just bought. She gave the kitchen a quick inspection, the way a meticulous hostess might scan her setup before guests arrive. I stepped quietly aside, giving her space to arrange the table how she liked. The evening started off normally. Ava and Ethan competed to show Ms. Wilson their latest school drawings. Lily babbled about her preschool day. I stayed quiet, more of a shadow than a presence, listening, nibbling, smiling only when Ava turned to ask me something. Jessica poured the wine, lifted her glass in a cheerful toast, then looked around the table and said with a laugh, "We're really lucky to have Grandma at home. Without her, Kevin and I would be scrambling just to keep up." I smiled. Was that a thank you? No. Her next words smothered that hope. She cooks, cleans, watches the kids, sometimes even helps out with little expenses here and there. I mean, really, what else can old folks do anymore? My nose stung, but I kept the smile on my face and said nothing. Miss Wilson chuckled politely, but the energy at the table dipped. I glanced at Kevin, hoping, praying he'd say something to break the awkward tension, but he just kept his head down, eating as if none of it had happened. I bit down hard on the inside of my cheek. Jessica sipped her wine and continued lighthearted as ever. But I'm lucky my mother-in-law knows her place. Not every older person does. I looked up and caught Ms. Wilson's eyes. A flicker of sympathy crossed her face. My cheeks burned, like I really was some freeloader, a burden in a house I was quietly paying for mortgage, groceries, tuition, and all. Kevin finally lifted his head, but not to defend me. He set down his utensils, exhaled, and avoided my gaze. There was hesitation, for just a second. Then it vanished, and he spoke, his voice flat. "If you're not happy here, Mom, maybe it's time you got your own place. I think you could use some space." The words dropped like iron. "If you're not happy here, maybe it's time you got your own place." That sentence echoed in my head, a dull knife, twisting deep, not fast enough to numb the pain. I sat frozen, listening to the clinking of silverware, Lily's giggle, the sounds of a world still spinning, as if nothing had just shattered. I kept my face calm, just as I'd learned to do over the years, swallowing every emotion down deep. But under the table, my fingers clutched the hem of my blouse, trembling uncontrollably. I used to think the worst kind of hurt came from strangers. But no, the deepest wounds are carved by those we love, the ones we believe will never turn their backs. One careless line, spoken without thought, and it felt like the whole house cracked beneath me. I don't know how long I sat there, time blurred, but in one hazy stinging moment, I understood I had become a stranger in the very life I'd spent my youth building. Ms. Wilson quickly set her glass down, forcing a nervous smile. No one dared to speak. The silence thickened, heavy, unfamiliar, like dust settling over forgotten memories. Ava looked up confused. Ethan stopped chewing and glanced at his father. Lily, the smallest and purest of them all, happily scooped spoonfuls of soup into her mouth, blissfully unaware of what had just happened. I placed my hand on my thigh, trying to steady my trembling fingers. An old mother sitting quietly at the dinner table, she once called home, hearing her son say, plain as day, "If you hate living with us, then go." And somehow I realized silence is its own kind of power. Silence to avoid arguing. Silence to avoid hurting anyone, even yourself. I placed my napkin gently on the table and stood. "Excuse me," I said, my voice calm, too calm. No one stopped me. Kevin said nothing. Jessica bowed her head, pretending to slice her meat. Ms. Wilson turned away, unsure what to do. I walked upstairs into my room, closed the door, leaned against the worn wooden frame, and shut my eyes. And right then, I knew I no longer had a place in this house. There were no tears. No one stopped me. I picked up my suitcase and stepped out the door light as a lost soul who had finally found the way out. I woke while it was still dark. No rooster crowed. No one called my name. The house was silent, as if it too knew that today would be different. I sat up, reached for the coat draped over the chair, and quietly stepped out of my room. A dim hallway light cast a pale glow on the cold wooden floor. In the hush of that early hour, I slid out the old suitcase from under my bed. It had traveled with me through my younger years, through jobs, cities, and short-lived escapes in search of fleeting peace. I didn't need much. A few changes of clothes, some personal belongings. I opened a drawer and took out my small notebook, the record of 3 decades worth of investments, the one thing left that proved I had built something in this life. And an old photo Kevin and me on the day he graduated high school, both of us grinning ear to ear. I stood there for a long while, taking one last look at the room. A simple bed, stained white walls, a tiny window facing the backyard. The room felt like me, plain worn, and no longer needed. I rolled the suitcase toward the hallway, its wheels clattering against the floor. Dry, hollow, final. In the kitchen, Jessica was already up, standing at the coffee machine, moving about as if I didn't exist. When she heard the sound of the suitcase, she looked up, a flicker of surprise in her eyes, then quickly turned away, pretending to be busy with her mug. I don't blame her. People only care when you still matter to them. Kevin stepped out of the bedroom, the dim yellow light revealing his tired, groggy face, messy hair, a wrinkled, old t-shirt. He froze in the doorway, staring at me, stunned, wordless. No one said a thing, not a single word to make me stay. I set the suitcase down, reached into my coat pocket, and pulled out a small, folded note. I placed it gently on the table. "Thank you for helping me realize what I truly need. No explanations, no blame, just truth." I took the suitcase and headed for the door. No glancing back, no hesitation. Outside, the air was thick with fog, cold, still. I pulled my collar up and walked down the damp stone path. Margaret was waiting at the curb, behind the wheel of her old pickup truck. She rolled down the window, offering me a steady, silent smile. I opened the door, placed my suitcase in the back seat, and climbed into the passenger seat. I didn't look back. There was no need. The truck rumbled softly and pulled away. In the rearview mirror, I saw Kevin still standing there, a statue of stone, frozen in place, watching. We passed by the familiar streets, the old grocery store, the cafe where I'd spent quiet weekend mornings, the small park where the kids used to play. All of it wrapped in a cold, fading mist, drifting further and further behind. Margaret drove slowly. Neither of us spoke. There was nothing left to say. The apartment I'd rented was on the west side of town, small, simple, with a balcony that overlooked a little lake. Not grand, not much, but mine. I stepped inside. The scent of freshly polished wood lingered in the air. Soft sunlight spilled through the curtain, stretching across the floor. My phone buzzed in my pocket. Kevin. I placed the phone on the table. Didn't answer. Back at the old house, things were starting to fall apart. Ava's tuition hadn't been paid. The utility bills were overdue. The mortgage, too. All the payments I used to handle, quietly gone. I closed my eyes and sighed, not out of regret, but relief. When the door of my new apartment clicked shut behind me, I knew I had left behind more than a house. I had walked away from years of invisible bindings that had kept me tethered to a life where love meant sacrifice and silence was mistaken for acceptance. Back there, chaos had just begun. But here, for the first time in a long time, I was finally free. When people get used to someone quietly cleaning up their mess, they don't know what to do when that person walks away. I sat in my small apartment, curled into the armchair by the window, hands wrapped around a steaming cup of tea. Outside, the lake was still like glass, mirroring a colorless gray sky. It had been a long time since I'd had a morning this quiet. The phone on the coffee table buzzed for the fourth time. Today, Kevin. I let it ring until the screen went dark. Silence. I had grown used to it. Sometimes, silence is the clearest answer of all. Across town, Kevin's house was beginning to unravel. A notice from the bank sat squarely on the dining table, mortgage, overdue 60 days. Next to it, a stack of bills, utilities, private school, tuition car, insurance, phone, charges piling up like a mountain ready to collapse. Jessica dropped into a chair, pulling at her hair, eyes wide with panic. Kevin, do something. Kevin flipped through the papers, each bill landing like a punch to the face. He knew. He had always known. It was his mother who had quietly paid these bills all these years. He had just chosen not to see it. Let himself believe it was normal, expected. Now, with no one left to fill the gaps, he realized how exposed he really was. He picked up the notice from Ava's school, no exam participation, without payment. In the corner, a stack of old documents, bank statements, dividend receipts, investment portfolios, bearing the name Linda Monroe. A world he had never wanted to face. His hands trembled as he opened the folder. Dividend income, $12,315 a month. ETF funds, dividend-paying stocks, long-term bonds, all investments my hands had built over 30 years as an accountant. And, for the last 10 years, those investments had quietly kept his family afloat, without complaint, without credit. Kevin froze. His arms dropped to his sides, limp. Jessica snatched the papers from his lap, flipping through page after page. What is this? Your mom had money. Kevin swallowed hard. Yes, he whispered. She had money. Jessica stared at him, as if trying to see straight through the man who now looked small, helpless, hollow. She had money, and she let us struggle like this. Her voice trembled, laced with fury. Kevin said nothing. He couldn't say that it was his own hollow pride, his fear of facing her quiet generosity, that made him pretend not to notice. He sank into the couch, head in hands. And for the first time, Kevin felt utterly, shamefully bare. Back in my apartment, sunlight slipped gently through the curtains. I stood, brewed another cup of tea, then returned to the table and opened the book I'd been reading, a worn novel about a woman who left everything behind to begin again. There was a knock at the door. Margaret, always calm, never in a rush. "Should I make more tea?" I smiled. She took a seat across from me, lifting the warm cup to her lips. "They've been looking for you," she said softly. "I know." Margaret looked at me, a glance that held both admiration and quiet sorrow. "It's not easy. Walking away." I smiled gently, hands wrapped around the cup. "It's not walking away," I said, voice steady. "It's learning how to move forward." Back at Kevin's house, the storm had broken. Jessica lashed out. "You're weak, Kevin. Spineless. You let your mother carry this family, and you still clung to your ego. Now she's gone." "What now?" Kevin roared. "You think I wanted this? You think this feels good to me?" They screamed at each other, words flying like knives. On the staircase, the children sat in silence, wide-eyed, frightened. Kevin gripped his phone with shaking hands, dialed my number. No answer. He called again this time, leaving a voicemail. "Mom, please come home. We need you." I heard the chime of the message arriving. I didn't open it. I placed the phone back down and took another quiet sip of tea. People only understand the value of light once they've tasted enough darkness. It was colder than usual that winter morning. I bundled up in a thick coat, pulled my knit hat low, wrapped a scarf tightly around my neck. Steam rose gently from the cup of tea in my hands. I walked to the park near my apartment. Bare trees lined the frozen path, old benches weathered by time, and a small lake glittering under the pale morning sun. I came here often, each morning, to sit quietly and watch the wild ducks glide across the icy surface. Today was no different, and yet something in the air felt changed. I sat down on the bench I always chose, exhaled softly, a trail of white breath drifting into the stillness. Behind me, footsteps crunched softly on the frost. I didn't turn. I had long since learned to sense the presence of others without needing to see them. Kevin stood there, his breath visible in the frigid air. He walked closer, each step slow, as if he carried a mountain on his back. "Mom!" His voice cracked, splintered in the cold wind. I kept my eyes on the lake. Kevin knelt beside the bench, his hands clenched, trembling. "Mom, I'm sorry." The wind carried away his tears. I remained silent, gazing at the gray surface of the ice. "Mom, I know I was wrong," he choked. "I was selfish, prideful, stupid. I never even knew how much I owed you." He leaned into my knees, like a child returning to the safety of a mother's arms after falling down. I placed my hand gently on his head, a gesture as old as motherhood itself. "Please forgive me." His voice broke. Jessica stood a short distance away, her hand wrapped tightly around Lily's. Ava and Ethan stood beside her, eyes wide, uncertain, sad. I looked at them, the 3 children I had once cradled, rocked to sleep, soothed through fevers and tears. Lily clutched her sister's arm, her gaze lifted to me. Ava stepped forward and asked softly, "Grandma, are you mad at Mommy and Daddy?" I smiled a peaceful smile. "No, sweetheart. I'm not mad at anyone. Kevin looked up, his eyes red and swollen. Please, come home with us. I shook my head gently but firmly. I forgive you, I said slowly. But I can't go back. Kevin blinked, confused. I'm not angry, I continued. But I also can't live in a place where I'm not truly wanted. We sat there in silence, letting the wind pass through us, cold, embracing, but honest. Margaret stood nearby, watching quietly. She knew there are some moments others have no right to interrupt. I stood, brushing a thin layer of snow from the bench. Go home, Kevin, I said softly. You have your life, and I have mine. Kevin lowered his head, his shoulders trembling. Jessica stepped forward with the children. For once, she said nothing. No sarcasm, no disdain, just a woman who finally realized she had lost something that could never be undone. Ava approached me, her hands shaking, holding out a small postcard. Grandma, will you take this? I bent down and took it. Crayon lines covered the card, a tiny house, a silver-haired woman by the window holding a teacup, and scrawled beneath it, Grandma, I miss you. I folded the card and slipped it into my coat pocket. They turned away, walking back toward the parking lot, their steps heavy and slow. No one said goodbye. There was no need. Some farewells don't require words, because deep down, everyone knows this time it's forever. I stood there for a long while, watching the children fade into the mist. The wind stirred again, whispering through the bare branches above. Sometimes an ending is really a beginning. We just don't realize it until it's far too late. That winter stretched on longer than most. Each morning, I brewed myself a cup of hot tea and sat by the window, watching the little lake freeze over inch by inch. The sky stayed gray. The trees stood bare. But in that bleak cold, I found a quiet peace I hadn't known in years. Back at the old house, Kevin and Jessica were learning to live without the safety net I once quietly provided, facing the weight they used to call normal. Kevin found a job at a small auto repair shop on the edge of town. It was hard work, and the pay was modest, but enough to start chipping away at the mortgage. He no longer had the pride to be picky. Jessica picked up extra shifts at the grocery store morning to night. No more time left for snide remarks or quiet contempt. The kids switched to public school. No more crisp white uniforms. No more pristine playgrounds. But I heard from an old neighbor that they laughed more now. That was enough for me. I changed, too. My apartment remained simple. A worn armchair, an old bookcase, a small wooden table by the window. Each morning I brewed my tea, read a few pages, or just sat in silence. Sometimes Margaret dropped by. She'd bring me old magazines or a couple of fresh scones from the town bakery. We didn't say much. At our age, friendship doesn't need many words, just presence and quiet understanding. One early spring morning, as the first shy beams of sunlight touched the lake's surface, I found a small envelope in my mailbox. No return address. Only 4 words, for Grandma. I opened it. It was the same postcard, the one from months ago. Only now Ava had added a drawing, a bare maple tree, and beneath it, a silver-haired woman with a cup of tea smiling softly. There was a new line written in crooked, childish handwriting. Grandma, when are you coming home? I slowly folded the card and tucked it into the book I'd left unfinished. The lake outside was still, but a thin layer of ice had melted, revealing clear, rippling water beneath. I put on my coat, wrapped my scarf, and stepped out with a fresh cup of tea in hand. The breeze was gentle, carrying the scent of damp earth and young grass. At the old park bench, I sat down, running my hand across the worn wood, faded and familiar. No one sat beside me. There was no need. I pulled the postcard from my coat pocket and studied it again. For a long while, I said nothing. Then I smiled, softly, peacefully. In the distance, Kevin was walking with Ava Ethan and Lily, strolling through the park paths. They didn't see me, and I had no intention of calling out. I simply watched from afar, the way old souls often do, watching the people they love go on living, knowing that some moments require us to step back and stay outside the frame. Kevin knelt to tie Lily's shoelace. Jessica stood nearby, holding a shopping bag, her face tired, but softer now, free of the arrogance she once wore like armor. I watched them quietly. No anger, no regret, only relief. I sipped my now cold tea. The breeze returned soft and crisp. The lake reflected a pale blue sky, shimmering in the early light. I used to believe that if I sacrificed enough, I would be appreciated. That if I quietly stood behind the scenes, carrying all the unspoken burdens one day, I'd be met with a look of understanding, a sincere word of thanks. But in the end, kindness, given the wrong way, becomes nothing more than habit, something others grow to depend on without gratitude. Unacknowledged sacrifice fades into a silent shadow, slowly forgotten in the very home I worked so hard to build. I chose silence once. I endured hoping that one day they would see. But life doesn't move forward on silent hope. It only changes when we dare to step out of our own darkness. I chose to let go, not out of anger, not from bitterness, but because I finally understood if I stayed, I was only hurting myself. Forgiveness isn't about forgetting the pain. It's about freeing your heart so you can move on, so you no longer carry the weight of old sorrows. It's about learning to smile, even when you see regret written across the faces of those who hurt you far too late. Some doors once closed don't need to be reopened, not because we're cold, but because we've learned to love ourselves first. I once stood on the sidelines of the lives of those I loved, sacrificing, enduring, staying silent. But now, I choose to stand on the edge of my own life, not as a passive observer, but as someone quietly, peacefully living on her own terms. When winter finally passes and the ice melts beneath the warmth of spring, I'll brew myself another cup of tea, sit by my small window, and let the rhythm of life drift gently past. No regret, no resentment, just this, a quiet smile, a steady step forward, and no need to look back. Because sometimes the greatest freedom in life is simply learning to let go of what we once held onto the tightest.